On the night of July 13th, on a narrow strip of sand at the edge of the Black Sea, a machine did something no machine had ever done before in the history of warfare. It came ashore, alone, on enemy-held ground, and opened fire. No boots touched the sand. No human pulse quickened in the dark as bullets cracked overhead. The only heartbeat anywhere near that beach belonged to an operator sitting behind a screen, kilometers away, guiding a small armored vehicle down a ramp and into contact with the enemy. Ukraine's 123rd Separate Territorial Defense Brigade would later describe it plainly. This was the first known combat mission of its kind anywhere in the world. And once you understand what actually happened on that beach, it's hard to disagree with them. The location was the Kinburn Spit, a long, curling tongue of sand and pine forest that Russian forces have occupied since the earliest months of the full-scale invasion in 2022. It sits at the mouth of the Dnipro estuary, directly across the water from the city of Ochakiv, and it has been, for years, one of the most dangerous, most heavily watched pieces of coastline in the entire war. Whoever controls the Kinburn Spit controls the approaches to two of Ukraine's most important southern ports, Mykolaiv and Kherson. Russian forces dug in there, use it as a forward base for artillery, for reconnaissance drones, for radar coverage, and for electronic warfare systems that reach out over the water and jam anything trying to approach. It is a choke point, a listening post, and a gun position all at once, and Ukraine has wanted it back for a very long time. Understanding why this particular operation matters requires understanding what it replaced. Ukraine actually planned an operation to retake the Kinburn Spit back in the autumn of 2022, not long after the liberation of the right bank of Kherson Oblast. That plan never happened. Instead, in the years that followed, Ukrainian forces attempted a different kind of contested river crossing, this one on the left bank of the Dnipro near the village of Krinky. That operation, carried out by human soldiers in small boats under constant artillery and drone fire, became a byword for just how costly and grinding an opposed amphibious landing can be when flesh and blood do the crossing. Soldiers held a bridgehead there for months under brutal conditions, and the losses were heavy on both sides. Krinky is, in a very real sense, the ghost hanging over this whole story. It's the demonstration of what happens when the only option is to send people across contested water into a fortified position. The Kinburn Spit operation on July 13th was, whether intentionally or not, an answer to that problem. Instead of sending a boat full of soldiers, Ukraine sent a boat full of nothing but machinery. Here is what actually took place, according to the units involved and the footage they released. An uncrewed surface vessel, essentially a small robotic boat, was remotely piloted across open water toward the occupied shoreline. This is not, by itself, new. Ukraine has been building a reputation for months and years now as the most sophisticated operator of naval drones in the world, mostly because of what those drones have done to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, sinking warships, damaging the Kerch Bridge, forcing Russian vessels to retreat from Crimean waters altogether and hide farther east. But on this mission, the boat wasn't carrying explosives to detonate against a hull. It was carrying cargo. As it approached the beach, the vessel essentially grounded itself in the shallows and lowered a ramp at its bow, the same basic principle used by landing craft since the Second World War, just scaled down and stripped of any human crew. Down that ramp rolled a tracked, armored ground robot, fitted with a remotely operated machine gun. Once it reached dry land, the ground robot advanced, took up a position, and its operator opened fire on a Russian target nearby. Analysts studying the released footage believe the vehicle involved may have been a Ukrainian-made robot from the Rise family, produced domestically and already used elsewhere in the war for logistics runs, casualty evacuation, and engineering tasks, here fitted out for a much more direct combat role. Other reporting, citing the manufacturer DevDroid, describes the ground vehicle as carrying a remotely operated weapon station chambered for a 62mm machine gun. Whichever specific platform it turns out to be, and Ukraine has been deliberately vague about the exact hardware involved, the concept is the same. One uncrewed system delivering a second uncrewed system into a place too dangerous for humans, and that second system then fighting on its own at a safe remove under human remote control. The operation was led by Colonel Ole Makuka, commander of the 123rd and Separate Territorial Defense Brigade, together with Major Dennis Hippik, who commands the brigade's 1st Unmanned Systems Battalion, a unit that has taken to calling itself, only half-jokingly, Terror from the Skies. In their public statement, the brigade summed up the mission's significance in words that are worth sitting with. They said this was a new approach to war, where the machine performs the most dangerous tasks, and Ukrainian soldiers write new rules for modern combat, adding that a raft carrying a ground robot makes it possible to put equipment into places where the risk to a human life would be unacceptably high. That's the entire logic of the mission in a single sentence. It's not about proving robots can do something dramatic for its own sake. It's about substitution, swapping a soldier's body for a machine's chassis in exactly the kind of moment where soldiers have historically died in large numbers, the moment of first contact with a defended shore. To appreciate how quickly this capability has developed, it helps to look at where Ukraine's drone boat program actually started and how far it has come. Ukraine's uncrewed surface vessels made their name doing something much simpler and much more violent, acting as unmanned suicide boats, packed with explosives, and driven at high speed into Russian warships. The Magura Vi-5 drone boats became infamous for their role in sinking Russian naval vessels, including the missile corvette Ivanovets, humiliating blows against a fleet that, on paper, vastly outmatched Ukraine's conventional navy, which barely exists after years of war. Other platforms, like the Sea Baby drones, evolved from pure kamikaze weapons into multi-role systems, some of them fitted with rocket pods, machine gun turrets, and other weapons of their own, turning what began as one-way explosive devices into reusable combat boats capable of striking multiple targets and coming home. What makes the Kinburn Spit mission genuinely different from all of that prior work is not the boat itself. It's the job the boat was given. Instead of being the weapon, the naval drone became the delivery vehicle, the landing craft, the thing that gets another weapon system to where it needs to be. That's a shift from naval drone as munition to naval drone as logistics and insertion platform, and it's a shift that opens up an entirely different category of missions. It's worth stepping back here and talking about the ground robot side of this equation too, because the sea drone getting all the attention slightly understates just how fast Ukraine's ground robotics program has been moving on its own. A year ago, unmanned ground vehicles in Ukrainian service were used mostly for the unglamorous, essential work of war, hauling ammunition forward to exposed positions, dragging wounded soldiers back out of the kill zone, laying or clearing mines, running communication cable, doing engineering tasks that would otherwise expose a human to artillery fire or first-person view drone strikes. That work alone has probably saved a significant number of lives, because casualty evacuation and resupply runs are some of the most statistically dangerous tasks a soldier performs in this war, given the density of drone surveillance and precision strike capability hovering over the modern battlefield. But over the past year, that role has been expanding rapidly, and combat missions, actual direct fire engagements carried out by armed, remotely operated ground vehicles, have become increasingly common rather than experimental. Ukrainian officials have been explicit about wanting to scale this up dramatically. Roughly 10,000 unmanned ground vehicles were manufactured in Ukraine over the past year, and the stated production target moving forward is 50,000 units, a five-fold increase, reflecting just how central this technology has become to Ukrainian battlefield planning. President Volodymyr Zelensky himself has flagged unmanned ground vehicles as one of the most urgent procurement priorities for the country's defense forces, telling a staff meeting earlier this year that contracting volume for these systems needed to increase significantly to keep pace with battlefield demand. That's not a minor bureaucratic note. That's the head of state of a country at war identifying ground robots as one of a handful of top-tier strategic priorities, alongside whatever else came up in that same meeting. One example that illustrates how far the armed ground robot concept has already come, separate from the Kinburn Spit mission itself, is the DevDroid TW-12. 7. A ground robot fitted with a heavy machine gun. According to Ukrainian military reporting, one of these systems held a forward position independently for 45 days, returning to friendly lines only periodically to refuel and rearm before heading back out to the same position. Sit with that for a second. A machine occupying a piece of contested ground for a month and a half, functioning essentially as an automated sentry and fire support position, without a soldier ever needing to occupy that same exposed spot for anywhere near that length of time. That is a genuinely different model of holding ground than anything that existed in this war even 2 years ago, and it's happening quietly, incrementally, well outside the kind of single dramatic headline that a beach landing generates. Which brings us to the concept analysts are increasingly using to describe missions like the one at Kinburn Spit, combined or layered unmanned operations. The idea is simple once you say it out loud, but it represents a real conceptual leap in how a military can be structured. Instead of treating naval drones, aerial drones, and ground robots as separate siloed programs, each doing their own narrow job, Ukraine is increasingly stitching them together into single missions, where one uncrewed system enables another. The naval drone gets the ground robot to the beach. The ground robot, once ashore, can do reconnaissance, probe for mines, engage a target directly, or simply hold a position and report back what it sees, all without a human anywhere near the actual point of contact with the enemy. Add in the aerial drones that Ukraine already uses constantly for overhead surveillance and strike coordination, and you start to see the outline of an entire tactical ecosystem built almost entirely out of remotely operated systems, with human decision makers positioned safely behind the front line, making choices through screens rather than through direct physical presence. Some commentators have started calling this remote combined arms, borrowing the old military term for coordinating infantry, armor, and artillery together, and updating it for a battlefield where all three of those roles might increasingly be filled by uncrewed platforms working in concert. It's worth being honest about why this particular piece of terrain was chosen for a demonstration like this, because it wasn't arbitrary. The Kinburn Spit is, by multiple accounts, close to an ideal proving ground for exactly this kind of capability, precisely because it's so hostile to a conventional human assault. It sits under constant Russian surveillance, artillery observation, and drone coverage, all concentrated onto a strip of land that in places narrows to just 100 yards wide. Any human landing force approaching that coast would be spotted almost immediately and would have very little cover once ashore, given that a large part of the terrain, while forested in areas, still leaves long stretches of open beach and sandbar exposed to observation from multiple directions. That combination, heavy enemy surveillance plus a well-defended, narrow, exposed shoreline, is exactly the scenario in which sending an expendable unmanned system makes tactical sense, in a way that sending soldiers simply doesn't. If the robotic landing craft or the ground robot is detected and destroyed, Ukraine loses hardware, which is a cost that can be replaced through the country's rapidly scaling drone production lines. If a human landing force had been detected in the same spot, the cost would have been measured in dead and wounded soldiers, families notified, and a much harder political and human toll to bear. That asymmetry, hardware losses versus human losses, is really the core strategic argument behind everything Ukraine is doing with unmanned systems right now, and the Kinburn Spit mission is simply the clearest, most literal illustration of it to date. Naturally, there are limits to how far this comparison can be pushed, and serious military analysts have been careful not to oversell what a single mission actually proves. A robot landing on a beach and firing a machine gun at a target is not the same thing as clearing and holding contested territory against a determined defense. The mission, as reported, appears to have been a raid or a demonstration of capability, not a full assault intended to seize and occupy ground. Ukrainian officials themselves have not claimed that the operation resulted in a lasting foothold on the Kinburn Spit, and the specific results of the engagement, what exactly was targeted, what damage was done, whether the ground robot survived and was recovered afterward, have not been fully disclosed. That's consistent with how Ukraine has handled disclosure around most of its unmanned systems programs throughout this war. Enough detail released to demonstrate the capability and its propaganda and morale value, but not so much that adversaries get a clear picture of the specific hardware, its vulnerabilities, or its operating procedures. So while the framing of world's first robotic amphibious assault is broadly accurate and has been repeated across multiple outlets covering the story, it's worth treating this as a proof of concept and a tactical raid rather than a wholesale substitute for conventional amphibious warfare doctrine, at least for now. Still, the trajectory matters more than any single data point, and the trajectory here is unmistakable. 2 years ago, unmanned ground vehicles in Ukrainian hands were mostly logistics tools. A year ago, armed ground robots holding fixed positions for extended periods were becoming a recognized, if still relatively novel, battlefield tactic. Now, a naval drone has successfully delivered an armed ground robot onto an enemy-held beach, and that robot has engaged a target under remote human control, all without a single soldier setting foot on that contested shore. Each of those steps individually looked at the time like an incremental improvement on existing technology. Stacked together, they describe a fairly rapid transformation in how amphibious operations, historically one of the most casualty-intensive forms of warfare in human history, from Gallipoli to Normandy to Incheon, might increasingly be conducted in the years ahead, at least in conflicts where one side has a significant edge in uncrewed systems, and the willingness to build and lose large numbers of relatively cheap machines rather than risk soldiers. This has not gone unnoticed by military observers outside Ukraine either, and it's worth situating this mission within a broader global pattern rather than treating it purely as an isolated Ukrainian innovation. The United States Navy has been experimenting with its own uncrewed surface vessels in other theaters, in elements of the U.S. Military's drone task force operating in the Middle East only began actively operating certain uncrewed surface vessel platforms earlier this year, a reminder that Ukraine, despite fighting a defensive war with a fraction of the resources of a major power, has in many respects become the world's leading real-world laboratory for uncrewed maritime and ground combat systems, tested under actual combat conditions rather than in a training exercise. Other militaries are watching closely, not because they necessarily plan to copy this exact tactic, but because the underlying lesson, that layered uncrewed systems can achieve tactical effects in high-risk coastal environments without exposing personnel, has obvious relevance well beyond the Black Sea. Any nation with contested coastlines, contested straits, or island chains, it might need to project force across or defend, and there are a great many nations in exactly that position around the world right now, has reason to study what just happened on the Kinburn Spit closely. It's also worth talking honestly about the limitations and the risks that come with this approach, because the technology is not magic, and it's not going to make amphibious warfare bloodless or simple. Uncrewed surface vessels are vulnerable to detection by radar and to interception by fast patrol boats or helicopters if the defending force has assets positioned to respond quickly. And a slow-moving drone boat grounding itself on a beach in order to unload cargo is, for that brief window, an extremely exposed and vulnerable target. Ground robots, for their part, are vulnerable to electronic warfare and jamming, which Russian forces have deployed extensively along contested sections of the front specifically to disrupt Ukrainian drone and robotic operations. And the Kinburn Spit itself has been described as an area with heavy Russian electronic warfare coverage precisely because Russian forces there understand how central uncrewed systems have become to Ukrainian tactics. A jammed ground robot, cut off from its operator's control signal, either stops functioning entirely or, depending on how it's programmed, may attempt some kind of autonomous fallback behavior. And either outcome represents a serious operational risk if the enemy can reliably disrupt the communication link. There's also the blunt mechanical reality that these systems, however sophisticated, are still relatively fragile compared to armored vehicles built for sustained combat, and a machine gun round, artillery fragment, or a well-placed first-person view drone strike can disable a ground robot just as effectively as it would injure a soldier, the crucial difference being simply that no one dies when it happens. None of this undermines the significance of what was demonstrated at Kinburn Spit, but it does suggest that this remains an evolving, imperfect capability rather than a finished, guaranteed solution, and that Russian forces will very likely adapt their own defensive posture and electronic warfare deployment specifically in response to this kind of threat, which will in turn push Ukrainian engineers to adapt their systems further. This is, in other words, the beginning of a new cycle of tactical and technical escalation between uncrewed attackers and uncrewed defenses, not the final word on the subject. There's a broader strategic and even ethical dimension to all of this that's worth sitting with as well. For as long as warfare has existed, the physical courage and physical risk borne by individual soldiers has been, in some sense, the currency of combat, the thing that made victory costly and that gave commanders reason to hesitate before ordering an assault into a heavily defended position. What Ukraine is demonstrating, mission by mission, is a model of warfare where that currency is increasingly decoupled from the outcome. A commander can order a robotic landing on a beach as hazardous as the Kinburn Spit with a completely different risk calculus than the one that governed the Krinky operation or any conventional amphibious assault in history, because the worst-case outcome is the loss of expendable hardware rather than the loss of trained soldiers and the grief that follows for their families. Advocates of this approach argue, reasonably, that this is a straightforwardly humane development, that any technology which reduces the number of young people who die or are maimed in war is worth pursuing and scaling as quickly as possible. And it's genuinely hard to argue with the value of a machine bearing risk that a human being would otherwise have to bear. At the same time, military historians and ethicists have long noted that lowering the perceived human cost of a given tactical action can also lower the political and psychological threshold for undertaking it in the first place, potentially making certain kinds of aggressive maneuver, raids, probing attacks, contested landings, more frequent simply because they've become cheaper in the currency that matters most to political and military leaders, namely casualties. Whether that trade-off nets out as a stabilizing force or a destabilizing one over the long run of this war, and of future conflicts that draw lessons from it, is a genuinely open question, and reasonable people watching this technology develop have landed on different sides of it. What has seemed clear, regardless of where you land on those broader questions, is that Ukraine's own military leadership sees this as just the opening move rather than a finished capability. In the aftermath of the Kinburn Spit operation, the 123rd Brigade's own public comment on what comes next was notably understated and, in its own way, more unsettling than any dramatic proclamation could have been. Reflecting on the mission, the brigade offered a simple, almost casual prediction that things are going to get even more interesting from here. Given how quickly this specific capability went from a manufacturer's press release about 10,000 ground vehicles a year to 50,000 planned, from ground robots doing ammunition runs to ground robots holding contested positions solo for 45 days at a stretch, to now an armed robot conducting what is being called the world's first fully robotic amphibious combat mission, there is no obvious reason to doubt that prediction. Zoom out far enough, and this single mission on a strip of sand most people outside Ukraine have never heard of starts to look like a marker. One of those moments military historians look back on decades later and point to as the beginning of something. The tank at Cambrai in 1917, the first carrier strike at Taranto in 1940, the first operational use of a cruise missile in anger. Small, almost modest-looking demonstrations at the time that nonetheless signaled a genuine shift in how militaries would fight going forward, long before the full implications had been worked out or the doctrine had caught up with the hardware. It would be premature and probably a little irresponsible to claim with total certainty that the Kinburn Spit landing belongs on that list. Wars produce a lot of firsts that turn out in hindsight to be dead ends or one-off stunts rather than the beginning of a real trend. But the underlying pattern here, naval drones scaling from expendable explosive boats into reusable multi-role platforms, ground robots scaling from logistics mules into independent combat systems capable of holding ground for weeks at a time, and now both of those trend lines converging into a single integrated capability that lets an armed machine be delivered to and fight from a beach that no human dared approach directly does not look like a stunt. It looks like the leading edge of a genuine and rapid transformation in amphibious warfare arriving not from a major power's defense research laboratory with an unlimited budget, but from a country fighting for its survival, building what it needs as fast as it can out of pure operational necessity. It's worth spending a moment on the economics of all this because numbers tend to make abstract strategic arguments concrete in a way that adjectives like significant or transformative never quite manage. A single uncrewed surface vessel of the type Ukraine has been mass producing costs a small fraction of what a conventional patrol boat or landing craft would cost, and a tracked ground robot fitted with a remote weapon station costs a fraction again of what an armored personnel carrier or infantry fighting vehicle would run. Multiply either of those figures by the number of units Ukraine is now producing, tens of thousands of ground robots planned for this year alone, and you start to see a production philosophy that looks less like traditional defense procurement and more like the logic of consumer electronics. Build a lot, expect losses, iterate quickly, and never let the loss of any single unit become a strategic setback. Compare that to the cost, in every sense of the word, of training an infantry soldier for months, equipping that soldier, and then either mourning that soldier's death or funding a lifetime of care if that soldier is wounded. And the calculus driving Ukraine's rapid pivot toward uncrewed systems becomes obvious. It isn't just about safety in the abstract. It's about a country with a finite and increasingly strained population, fighting a war of attrition against a much larger adversary, looking for every possible way to substitute manufactured hardware for human lives in the parts of the fight where that substitution is technically possible. Robotic amphibious raids are, in that light, not just a tactical curiosity. They're a demographic and industrial strategy playing out in real time, one raid at a time. It's also worth noting how this development sits alongside Russia's own, much less publicized efforts in the same space. Russian forces have fielded their own uncrewed ground vehicles and have experimented with various remote weapon stations over the course of the war, though open-source reporting suggests Russia's programs have generally lagged behind Ukraine's in both the pace of battlefield integration and the sheer scale of production. Part of that gap likely reflects doctrine and institutional culture as much as raw technical capability. Large militaries with established procurement bureaucracies and a preference for proven, mass-produced conventional systems often adapt more slowly to battlefield innovation than a country like Ukraine, which has been forced by circumstance to treat its defense industry more like a wartime startup ecosystem than a traditional arms sector. That said, it would be a mistake to assume this gap persists indefinitely. Russian military bloggers and state media have both, at various points, showcased their own ground robot prototypes. And it's reasonable to expect that a demonstration as widely covered as the Kinburn Spit landing will accelerate Russian efforts to field comparable systems of their own, if only to blunt the psychological and propaganda impact of watching Ukraine repeatedly showcase capabilities Russia cannot yet match. War has always worked this way. One side's innovation becomes the other side's homework assignment, in the cycle of escalation and imitation that has defined drone warfare over the past several years. First-person view attack drones, then naval kamikaze boats, then electronic warfare countermeasures, then counter-drone systems shows no sign of slowing down. If anything, a mission like this one just added a new item to that list for both sides to study. There's also a quieter but important story here about doctrine catching up with hardware, something that tends to lag behind battlefield innovation in every war in history. Having the technical capability to land a robot on a beach is one thing. Building an actual doctrine around it, deciding when this tactic makes sense versus when a human-led operation is still preferable, working out command structures for coordinating naval drones and ground robots and aerial surveillance assets together as a single integrated mission, training the operators who need to fly, drive, and fire these systems under real combat pressure and likely under jamming, and building the logistics chains to keep tens of thousands of these machines fueled, charged, repaired, and resupplied at the front is an enormous undertaking that no single dramatic mission announcement can capture. The 123rd Brigade's own 1st Unmanned Systems Battalion, The unit responsible for this operation represents exactly the kind of specialized formation that this doctrinal shift requires, a unit built from the ground up around uncrewed systems, rather than one that simply bolted a drone team onto an otherwise conventional infantry structure. Expect to see more formations like it, not just in Ukraine, but eventually in other militaries, paying close attention to how this war is being fought, as armies around the world begin restructuring around the reality that a growing share of frontline combat power may increasingly sit behind a screen rather than behind a rifle. None of this is to say that human soldiers are becoming obsolete, and it would be a serious overstatement to suggest that. Holding ground, clearing buildings, negotiating complex urban terrain, making the kind of split-second ethical and tactical judgment calls that still exceed what remote operators and current robotic systems can reliably manage under contested conditions. These remain fundamentally human tasks, and there is no serious military analyst suggesting robots are about to replace infantry wholesale anywhere in this conflict or the next one. What's actually happening is narrower, and in some ways more interesting than a wholesale robotic replacement of the infantryman. Specific categories of the most dangerous, most exposed tasks, the first wave of an amphibious assault, holding an isolated forward position under constant fire, running supplies across open ground under drone surveillance, are being peeled off one by one and handed to machines, while humans retain the roles that require judgment, adaptability, and physical presence that current technology simply can't replicate. The Kinburn Spit mission is a clean example of exactly that kind of task substitution, applied to arguably the single most historically costly moment in any amphibious operation, the moment the landing force actually reaches the beach and makes first contact with a waiting defender. No soldier set foot on that shore. That's the sentence Ukraine's military wanted the world to remember about July 13th. And it's the sentence worth ending on, because it captures, in the plainest possible terms, exactly what has changed. For most of human history, that sentence would have meant nothing happened, that no attack took place, that the beach remained untouched. On the Kinburn Spit, it meant the opposite. It meant an assault happened, a target was engaged, a piece of enemy-held coastline was contested and struck, and the only thing that crossed the water and walked onto that sand was a machine. Whatever comes next in this war, and in the wars that will inevitably study it afterward, that inversion, an attack without a single attacker physically present, is the story this mission actually tells, and it is very likely only the first chapter of it.